Welcome back. KXEL Live and Local continuing in this 8 o'clock hour on a Wednesday. Hello, I'm Jeff Stein. By the way, Wednesday, March 13th is the date. And as you heard in the Iowa Almanac earlier this morning, and if you missed it, you'll hear it later today, this is the 90th anniversary of the day the John Dillinger gang robbed a bank in downtown Mason City in broad daylight 90 years ago today. And you heard a little bit about it in the Almanac, but if you were with us when our upcoming guest was with us in January, you'd have heard all about it. It was the cover story in the January-February edition of Iowa History Journal. Joining us by Zoom is the owner and publisher of the magazine, Michael Swanger. He also authored that cover story in the January-February issue. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Jeff. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back on your show.
We did talk in great detail about the Dillinger story that you wrote, and it had so many facts that I was not aware of. What was the reaction to that story? Because, again, 90 years and this notorious gang right up I-35, today's I-35 in Mason City.
A similar reaction to many stories that we published, Jeff, which is the typical, I didn't know that happened here, or I didn't know this person was here in Iowa or was from Iowa. I think this one did especially surprise folks because Dillinger is such a big name. Obviously, he was the first public enemy #1 and was the crime spree that he committed across the Midwest in about a year's time was the impetus for the FBI as we know it today. And he was the thorn in the side of J. Edgar Hoover. And I just don't think folks connect those things with Iowa. We think of our place as being fairly pastoral, and it's just not the kind of place where that kind of thing happens. But it sure did happen, as you said, 90 years ago in Mason City when the Dillinger gang shot their way out of town with $52,000 on hand.
That's what we get for letting people from Illinois and Ohio into the state of Iowa. Well, if you did not get a chance to get a copy of the magazine when it was fresh on the newsstand, I bet, do you still have copies available if they want to order through the website?
Yes, we do. They're available at iowahistoryjournal.com, or they can call us. Happy to get them set up with a copy. We have a few left. And as you know, our back issues become collectible at some point because we don't have a huge overflow of them in our back stock, and people collect them because they want to complete their collections of IHJ. So this is definitely a good one to get. And I'm not saying this to pressure folks, but I know this particular issue is low in stock.
So if you go to iowahistoryjournal.com, you can not only buy the January-February issue, but you can also subscribe, and then we don't have to have this conversation every 2 months about you not getting your magazine, people. Go subscribe right now. It's a great rate at a 2-year subscription at iowahistoryjournal.com. Well, that was January, February. We have literally turned the page, and what a beautiful cover. You have such imaginative covers on the magazine, the Dillinger Wanted poster last time, but this is an interesting photo, and the cover story has to do with Iowans in the Battle of Shiloh. Fill us in, please.
Well, Jeff, one of the challenges of putting the magazine together every issue is coming up with appropriate artwork that is period appropriate, time appropriate. And after a long and hard search for something about the Battle of Shiloh that would depict Iowa soldiers in it, there were 11 regiments from Iowa who fought in that battle April 6th through the 7th in 1862. I came across an artist in North Carolina named Dan Nance who specializes in historical art. And he was grateful and appreciative of the opportunity to share his work with us. I don't know if his work had graced the cover of a magazine yet, so he was looking forward to that. He does incredible work. We included his website on there. I would encourage folks to check it out because he does amazing work. So that was the first battle of the story, no pun intended, of trying to get the right artwork to go with that. In short, Don Doxey, who we've talked about before, the retired sports writer for the Quad City Times, is also a Civil War buff. I think we've discussed this before. You know, not everyone is just shoehorned into one lane. You and I certainly understand that. But he's a Civil War buff, and he had actually visited the park in Tennessee, where there's a monument to the Battle of Shiloh. And he'd done this a few years ago, some years back, and had been itching to write about it. So I was really happy that I had him available to us to write this story, because it's one of the more compelling stories, I think, about the Civil War and Iowans' involvement in it, because it was really the first major battle in the Civil War that set the tone for, frankly, just how bloody and up close and how fierce it was.
We have talked about this before because of other stories that you have carried in Iowa History Journal online, iowahistoryjournal.com. Iowa had more men, and again, it was all men at the time, more men mustered into service per capita than any other state in the Union. And that's just fascinating to me, because Iowa had not even been a state for 20 years by that point.
That's right. More than 76,000 men. I believe there was a little over 13,000 casualties by the time the war was over with. When Lincoln put the call out for help, Iowa's governor, Kirkwood at the time, was more than willing to help. Of course, Lincoln had a great connection with the state. And Iowa did their part and then some. And in particular, the Battle of Shiloh, because even though there were regiments that fought throughout the war, there were 11 regiments from across the state that fought at Shiloh. And as I mentioned, it really kind of set the tone for the rest of the war. There were more than 6,600 Iowa men who fought at Shiloh, and a little bit, about a third of them, 2,400 men to be exact, 2,409 men to be exact, were killed, wounded, or missing when the two-day engagement concluded. And if I can, just for a moment, this was obviously fought in Tennessee. It was an area where there was a small church named Shiloh, and it was on the Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. And if I can, just for a moment, I just want to share this brief comment that Don wrote about it.
You bet.
Shiloh, these are his words. Shiloh was a battle that completely altered the way in which the nation viewed the Civil War. The war had begun not quite a year earlier, and although there had been a few significant battles, there were lingering doubts about how big a crisis it was going to be. There were some other battles, of the Battle of Bull Run and Fort Donelson, where the casualties amounted to less than 5,000. But at Shiloh, it brought a whole new level of carnage that would be repeated throughout the war. Over the course of those 2 days, 23,746 men from Union and Confederate armies were killed, wounded, or missing, accounting for more casualties than had been incurred in all previous American wars combined. That, to me, is a stunning piece of information about the significance of this battle and how it shaped the war.
Absolutely staggering. And again, it's numbers like that that are crazy big, technical phrase, crazy big, but it puts it into context. It helps us understand it, because you can start seeing tens of thousands, in your mind as you see a number, and then you can figure, well, that's the size of this town, the entire town being lost, et cetera. I mean, that really is what makes it in full context, puts it in full context.
Well, and at the heart of the battle was a place called the Hornet's Nest. So on the first day of the battle, in short, and I'm going to try to summarize what Don wrote,
sure,
is that Grant had about 40,000 troops. He was up against the Confederate Army of the Mississippi, led by General Johnston, which had about 44,000 troops. And they were waiting, the Union forces were waiting for reinforcements to arrive. In the meantime, the Confederates attacked. And when they called up some reserves to help hold the line, it was Iowans, for the most part, that did that. They were the ones at the Hornet's Nest who saw the fiercest fighting up close. It was bloody. Many were killed, as I mentioned earlier, or wounded. And of course, some were captured too and held prisoner. We actually have a photo of a reunion of a brigade from the Hornet's Nest that met in 1923 in Ottumwa. We have a picture of some of the veterans that met later. So they played a significant line. And even though they had to retreat from that initial position, if they were not there to hold it the way they did, I think the battle would have been over that day. So that's how important it was. And news of the bravery of the Iowa men who fought at the Hornet's Nest spread across the country. And in the story, Don includes all the newspaper headlines and mention of what they did.
Heroes among heroes, Iowans in the Battle of Shiloh. That's the cover story for the current March-April edition of Iowa History Journal. The author of that article, award-winning journalist Don Doxey. Our guest on the program, the publisher and owner of IHJ, Michael Swanger. And again, he joins us on News Talk 1540 KXEL. IowaHistoryJournal.com is the website where you can subscribe or purchase individual copies. Copies are also available in many stores that people will come across, a wide variety. The whole list is on the website, but give us, Mr. Swanger, a little sample of where we might find the 6 issues a year of Iowa History Journal on the newsstand.
We're sold at every Barnes & Noble in the state, and of course, in your immediate listenership area, if I can describe it that way. We are at Barnes & Noble in Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, and Coralville. We're also selling it now in Omaha and Mankato, Minnesota. We're branching out. And of course, most Hy-Vee stores, Books A Million, Select Walmart, Mills Fleet Farm, etc.
And if you're one of those who supports the magazine, and even if you subscribe, check it out. I mean, check to see if it's on the newsstand, and if not, just pull that Hy-Vee manager aside and say, how come? And that may help make the difference when people ask for it.
I think that's a great idea. Grab them in aisle 6 or 7, wherever they're hanging out, and pull them in. I love that.
All right, you get a chance on occasion, rare. That's the ironic thing. You own and run a magazine because you like to tell stories, and you rarely get to do it because you're busy owning and running a magazine, but it's a baseball story. You had to write it, didn't you?
Of course. I appreciate that, Jeff. I make no apologies about it. I have a little bit of a bias towards America's favorite pastime. So now, admittedly, I am a White Sox fan, but that was not the reason for me writing the story about Bob Feller's opening day no-hitter in 1940. Again, we've written a lot about Bullet Bob over the year. I think Iowans are more than familiar with the heater from Van Meter, but we had not dove into that historic opening day no-hitter, which is a big part of his impressive resume that obviously propelled him into the Hall of Fame. And that happened on April 16th, 1940 at my favorite old-time baseball park, the late former Old Comiskey Park on the south side of Chicago. And it was just an amazing accomplishment because he was so young in his career. He was really just about to reach his peak in terms of his prowess with not only his stuff, but his reputation. And on that cold, blustery 40-some degree day, as it would be in Chicago on any opening day, and I've experienced those firsthand, he was amazing. His Cleveland Indians team, which are now known as the Guardians, won 1-0 that day. They scored 1 run in the 4th. That's all they need. Bob did not have his best stuff that day. He had tremendous stuff, but he, in terms of his fastball, was legendary. He had a great curveball, but it was so windy that it really affected the effectiveness of his curveball. So after about the 3rd inning, he just stuck with his fastball and rode it the rest of the way. So it wasn't a perfect game. He had a few walks. There was an error committed. There were runners on base. And warming up in the pen, all the things that I researched to write the story, he said he did not feel good about it at all. So I think that's the case with a lot of no-hitters in baseball, which is you need a little bit of luck. You need a gem of a defensive play. And of course, you need some skill. And all 3 of those things were in effect that day for Bob on April 16th, 1940 in Chicago.
And like you, I would call it the real Comiskey Park as opposed to any imitators that have come down the line since. How old was he at the time, Bob Feller?
Well, he was just in his early 20s. He would have been
and by that time, though, a veteran, multiple. I mean, he played in the major leagues, then came back for his senior year of high school, didn't he?
That's right, because he threw his first major league games when he was 17. So you're right. So he was a veteran by that. He was like 21, 22. And it is amazing to think about it that way, isn't it, when you provide that kind of context. But he always said afterwards, later on, that he was somewhat surprised that he threw. It was the first of a couple that he threw, that it worked out the way it did. And in particular, what makes the story interesting to me was that I found Sec Taylor's report from the Des Moines Register. And so I take the reader frame by frame, how the game played out, and use Sec's quotes and his colorful analogy of the game to help kind of spice it up. So it's fun to read Taylor's uh, view of the game, and it kind of adds life to it, frankly, that otherwise I had not read Taylor's report in the past. And so I was really happy to find it, and it added some great detail and color to the story.
And interesting, again, that that would have been written because, again, that was a trip to Chicago from Des Moines. But the Iowa kid was pitching, and Sec Taylor being quite the baseball man. That's, of course, how he got his nickname, because he was the secretary for a minor league team along the way. And that, of course, led to Des Moines getting professional baseball. I have to tell you, by all rights, when I get a magazine, I should just start at the beginning and work my way through, but I don't. I see what's in it, and then I choose my favorite articles, and I read those first. And I have to tell you, knowing you were going to write about Bob Feller's opening day no-hitter, that's the first article I read, and it really, even for a non-baseball fan, like some folks listening might be, it really moved along. There's a lot more in the magazine. I want to take a break. Bottom of the hour break on this Wednesday morning. So I'll ask Michael Swanger of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com, to stay with us. You'll hear today's Lou Dobbs business report, the opening Bloomberg Money Minute, Fox News and Weather. More on the other side on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk. Welcome back. KXEL Live and Local continuing in this 8 o'clock hour on a Wednesday, and we're continuing our conversation with Michael Swanger. Mr. Swanger is the publisher and owner of Iowa History Journal. We've been discussing the March-April issue. That's the brand new issue out on newsstands all over the place and available, of course, single copy and subscription at iowahistoryjournal.com. The cover story about Iowans in the Battle of Shiloh. We've talked about that story, Michael. We've talked about the piece you wrote about Bob Feller's opening day no-hitter. You always bring up stories that I know nothing about, and here's one, the Iowa homemaker. And it should not surprise the audience that there's an Iowa State University connection, but tell me more, please.
I was approached about a year ago from a student who is a graduate student now studying history at Iowa State. His name is Samuel Page, and he emailed me and asked if I was familiar with the work of Fred and Bess Ferguson, and I asked who that was. And he told me that he had been doing some diving into Iowa State's archives. I'm sure it was for one of his projects that he had to complete for graduation. But nonetheless, he unveiled something, as you said, that I also did not know about, which was this couple of writers who met at Iowa State, married while they were at Iowa State, and they together honed their skills as writers and their interest in science and agriculture and home economics to benefit Iowans and those really, frankly, across the nation during the Great Depression. They wrote farm and home advice stories to help rural citizens get through, obviously, a very difficult period. And I had heard of the Iowa Homemaker. I knew it was an early magazine that the college had published. I believe the first issue was in 1921, but I didn't know the story behind it in terms of who the first editor was, which was Bess, which was, looking back at that time, was really amazing.
Yeah.
That she was the editor of it. And so he did a great job of unearthing a story that, like you mentioned, and as I admitted to, I don't think a lot of people know about.
It makes sense as we look at it today that a century ago, Iowa State would have been on the forefront of this. And we've told stories about people who majored in home ec, as it was called at the time, et cetera. But we have to consider that 100 years ago, Iowa State was not that old an institution. It had only been around as a land-grant institution for roughly 50 years or thereabouts. And so that really puts an additional spin on this.
It does. This is when it was known as Iowa State College. This is before Iowa State University. That was the focus for the school, obviously, when it opened, was agriculture and home economics and other things too. But yeah, it really is incredible to think about. We've talked about other folks who kind of helped put Iowa State on the map beforehand. But I think in terms of national recognition in terms of people who did things that weren't perhaps involved with sports, for instance, that maybe they had about as far a reach as any Iowa State graduate or student did at that time because of their work for national publications. And they did, and it wasn't just your typical reporting. I mean, Fred was he graduated. He got his bachelor's of science degree from Iowa State in 1922 in animal husbandry and journalism. So he wasn't just like a regular journalist. I mean, he had a scientific mind, a scientific background. After graduation, he worked as a field secretary from 1922 to 1924 for the Iowa State Dairy Association before joining the staff at Iowa State as a publications editor, where he was from 1924 to 1953. He died early. He died prematurely. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Bess is very similar minded to Fred in that she studied, she was unaware at the time when she began to study home economics at Iowa State that it was really about to enter the golden age. And so all the things that they did were things that they learned in terms of a practical manner, and they wanted to share their firsthand knowledge, their firsthand experience of what they learned at Iowa State with readers. So it wasn't just like me going out and interviewing someone for a story. They had that firsthand knowledge and experience to bring to what they wrote.
This also is interesting to me because of the way that you learned of the story. As you said, someone who was doing some research on the topic came upon it and wondered if you knew about it. You get a lot of ideas that way, and I trust that there are some folks listening who may have read the magazine now into its 16th year. That's hard to believe, but that time flies. But they may have a story that they haven't seen in the magazine, but they themselves may not feel like they should be the author. They don't have that journalistic bent. You love to hear from folks anytime, anywhere with regard to possible stories. That doesn't have to be from the author himself or herself.
I welcome that, Jeff. I think that's how we get some of our best ideas. You know, it would be easy for us to kind of sit back and just write about icons all the time. But then after a while, you're going to run out of them, and there's only so many ways you can tell those stories. So, you know, I make a concerted effort with every issue that we are writing about, for the most part, if I can use that term, you know, everyday Iowans, to include something about them in every issue, and those stories typically come, as you mentioned, as suggestions from readers. So I love that when people call, email me. I get notes with subscription renewals. Hey, have you considered this? Have you thought about it? I love that stuff. So yeah, I welcome it.
Well, and there have been times where you, over the course of the life of the magazine, a topic has been examined more than once, but in very different ways. And that's kind of an interesting thing, too, because the articles are designed to be a certain length so that they tell a good full story, but there may still be some additional material that could be used a second time 4 or 5 years later. You've done that multiple times as well. I would be remiss, we can't leave without mentioning our mutual friend Arvid Huseman, who, given his hatred for winter, it's amazing that he's retired to the Des Moines area, but he has. Thank goodness he stays here. He doesn't go south, does he?
He's an Iowan through and through, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. His disdain for winter is hilarious. And he, you know, folks who read his column understand he has a very whimsical, humorous, dry humor. He just has a unique touch. And as he writes in his column for our current issue, his growing disdain as he gets older for the winter, I don't think he's alone. So I'm sure there's a lot of Iowans who feel that way. I'm starting to feel that way too. So, but no, it's a fun read. It's great. Of course, you know, I say that as we just experienced, you know, almost 80-degree weather yesterday, and of course it'll be rainy and wet tomorrow, and that's how it goes.
Well, I was going to say, of all the mild winters, all right, that January could just be forgotten. But on either end, even Arvid had to be pleased. All right, so it's iowahistoryjournal.com. That is where you can subscribe, get the current issue, get back issues, whatever you need. iowahistoryjournal.com. There's a full list of stores. IHJ near you is the tab at the top of the page, and it lists all the locations. And my, that is quite a spreadsheet that you have up there. And give us a sense. I don't want to give away much, but you, and we'll peel the curtain back a bit, you plan roughly a year in advance. You have to be able to budget, as we call it in the business, time and space, etc. Give us a sense just broadly of a few of the topics that we're going to see before the end of the calendar year.
Well, we're working on our May, June issue as we speak, Jeff, because believe it or not, we go to press in about 2 weeks,
Wow.
less than 2 weeks with that next issue. So, yeah, the turnaround time is here before we know it. There's going to be a story in the next issue that falls into the category of what we were just talking about regarding the Fergusons. Someone approached me with it. It's a story I don't know. I should say guarantee, but I would be very surprised if most people have heard of the person that we're going to write about, a well-known stunt pilot. I'll leave it at that. And then, of course, we'll have some big subjects that people are going to be aware of. But I feel like this year, as much as we try to hit the big subjects for the cover, I feel like we have more feature stories made perhaps this year than we have in any other year that I think are going to be a little bit of surprising to folks. And again, I hate to use the term everyday Iowans. We're all Iowans. We're all important. We all play an important role in our state's history. But there will be many more of those stories this year.
And that, friends, is what we call a tease. This is not your first day, is it?
Well, you're very kind to a print guy. You make it easy for me. I appreciate you.
All right. It's Iowa History Journal, March-April edition, and the cover is Iowans in the Battle of Shiloh, Heroes Among Heroes, iowahistoryjournal.com. Michael Swanger, owner and publisher of that fine magazine, thanks so much for the time, as always.
Thank you, Jeff. Have a great day.
You do the same, sir. Michael Swanger, Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. And he joined us via Zoom from his home base in the Des Moines metro area on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk.